Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Wrestling with Memories. I am your co-host Vash, the man that Wax has never beaten and never will. We're going to jump into part 2 of our look at early 1991 now, starting off with the Royal Rumble. So Wax, let's go back a month, right? Because we mentioned the Royal Rumble a few times, and we're not going to review it properly because once again we weren't watching it live at the time, but I know you've got some brainstorms on it. So what were your views on that event leading into what will be WrestleMania?
Yeah, well, firstly, I mean, any Royal Rumble is a major event in the WWF, WWE calendar, and I would say both of us probably put the Royal Rumble up there at number 2, but just behind WrestleMania in terms of events. So anytime a Rumble comes around, it's going to be exciting regardless of what's happening. And this particular Rumble, we probably had a pretty strong undercard with the Rockers opening up against the Orient Express. Now, the Rockers, I think, are probably one of the most popular tag teams of the era. Very, young-looking guys, although Marty Jannetty wasn't necessarily young. They were probably one of the few tag teams that were doing proper tag team wrestling, where they would do joint maneuvers and they would do synchronized maneuvers. That wasn't always the case with WWE or WWF tag teams. But seeing them at that stage, Fash, did you think either of them would turn into a major superstar further down the line?
Well, that's the thing, right? Because obviously Shawn Michaels became one of the greatest legends ever of that team, and Marty Jannetty didn't. Um, at that point, probably not. And once again, I guess from watching it from a live point of view, even in that kind of late period of '91, this was just before their breakup and
Yep.
Shawn Michaels becoming a bad guy. But at that point, you wouldn't have thought they were, like, as you said, the most unique tag team they had. But they weren't like the top tag team. They were the kind of guys that had great matches, but they would then
Yep.
lose to the team that would then take on the champions. At that point, I think you couldn't have seen what was going to happen in the future. But as you mentioned, this match, it probably is one of the best matches up to that point in the WWF era because it was actually outstanding. And I went back to watch it and was surprised at how good it actually was, and it actually does stand the test of time.
Definitely. And then later on in the show, we had another angle play out between Ted DiBiase and Virgil against Dusty and Dustin. So in the weeks leading up to this, Ted DiBiase increasingly would get annoyed and angry with Virgil. His, I don't know what would you call Virgil? His
I think to be
slave,
politically
his
correct, he was his bodyguard. I think that's probably the
Okay.
PC term to use rather than his slave.
The whole thing played out with Virgil eventually turning on Ted DiBiase, taking the $1 million belt and wiping him out. And the fans actually reacted very strongly to that. It was a shame that Virgil, actually not a great wrestler, didn't have that great a look to him. He was never going to have a strong run as a singles performer. Once they got rid of him and Ted DiBiase together, there wasn't really much use for him.
Well, see, as you say, at that point, though, the crowd went crazy, right?
Yeah.
I remember this. I've not watched it recently, but because the storyline was that he'd came in as bodyguard since 1987 or whatever, he was treated terribly. So they kind of ran this for 3 years. And subtly, as it got to this point, they was like really treating him badly. And the crowd was just willing him on to turn on this despicable character that was the $1 million man. And when he did, the crowd did go crazy. And I think the next 6 to 9 months, Virgil was the most popular he ever was, and they had a couple of matches that were huge matches. But as you say, once that was out of the way, there was no further upside in the character. But this, you're probably seeing here, that storyline was a bigger deal than the actual match.
Yep.
Because I say after this, Dusty and Dustin are gone.
Yep. And just talking about Ted DiBiase, he was probably one of the best heels in the business. Very hated. His whole character about being this super rich man, very arrogant. Played really well against the audiences. And he probably never got the main event run against a Hogan or a Warrior that he probably deserved.
Yeah, because when he came in first, wasn't it? And when we watched this going back, he was presented as the guy who was going to buy the WWF title with his money, and initially he was positioned with Savage and Hogan, but as you say, there wasn't that one-on-one big pay-per-view match with Hulk Hogan. And once that feud initially ended, he kind of moved into more of a mid-card position, but one of the most memorable characters again, and somebody that we will discuss in future episodes.
Yep. And the show featured multiple of these classic characters that we grew up with. The Boss Man, we had the Barbarian, the Mountie, Coco Beware, and his parrot. It, it was a great time for the business. Everyone had a character they were playing, and to me, I certainly thought it brought a lot of color and entertainment to the screen. What were your thoughts, Fash? Back then, there was nobody real; it was all characters.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, it was all about the characters then. So even now, people talk about it. Everyone had a gimmick, and that was the key word here. They had something that made them stand out, which you could argue doesn't happen now. So even I know it goes back to it was larger than life characters and gimmicks, and that's what you remember, right? Because people will remember the wrestlers; they won't necessarily remember the matches and things. It was more about just the color that was added to everything. And as you say, this show had a lot of those type of characters in it.
Yep. And talking about two big characters, next up we've got the title match between Ultimate Warrior and Sergeant Slaughter. Obviously, the WWF had decided by this point that they wanted Hogan in the main event of WrestleMania. And to do that, they wanted a big heel to play off against him, and that was going to be Sergeant Slaughter. We'll talk about more about the war angle after the Rumble
Well, that's
review.
the thing, is it? Because you mentioned the Gulf War at the beginning, and this was Sergeant Slaughter. I deliberately didn't mention when I was talking about the big debuts because he was brought in um, as a character that would eventually become this Iraqi sympathizer, and that was the storyline they chose to follow with the great American hero taking him on. And this was the first kind of major step to it when he defeated the Ultimate Warrior for the title, and nobody saw this coming. And I remember, when you go back and watch this event, everyone's just deflated and angry. After you can hear the anger in the audience because nobody saw it coming. That's how real it was to everyone there.
Yep. And to set it up and to protect Warrior potentially, they had Macho Man come in and interfere in the match. He takes his scepter and smashes Warrior. And when I say smash, he
It looked
smashed
real.
him.
It looked like
It
he really
looked as
smashed his head
real.
in.
And I was so surprised watching it back then. I was thinking, this guy has put his full force into that, and the scepter went everywhere, smashed into a million pieces. And Slaughter eventually picks up Warrior and finishes him off and takes the title. It was a massive shock because Warrior was still a massive character, a massive player into the WWF, and for him to lose the title to Slaughter at that time would have been a shock. But naturally, it builds up to the WrestleMania event that we're going to talk about a bit later on.
And obviously you're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into this whole storyline about the Gulf War and using it, because we're just touching upon it right now because there's various views on this. But
Yep.
yeah, this is probably in hindsight a wrong move when you look back at it.
Yep. And then on to the Rumble main event. Obviously, we mentioned Royal Rumbles are usually, excellent matches, typically because you get to see 30 men, 30 different characters come in and, have a spot each. The problem with this Rumble, I thought, was the action was a little bit slow. And that probably goes towards who was in the ring the longest. We had, people like Greg the Hammer Valentine and Rick Martel, all great characters and great wrestlers back in the day. But the fact that the style of wrestling that they had meant that everything was a little bit slow throughout the whole match. I mean, they went 45 minutes and an hour respectively, so naturally they played a big part in the Rumble. It eventually picked up when Hogan came in, and the problem with the finish of this one is that it was just entirely predictable.
Yeah, it was, even if you didn't
Hogan,
get it, you got it.
yeah,
You knew Hogan was going to win, right?
Hogan had to win, and as usual, Hogan must pose at the end of the show, and we know he's off to WrestleMania, and that's your WrestleMania 7 main event sorted: Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter.
Well, as the thing, see with this Rumble, I agree. I thought it was a dull one, to be honest. I didn't like it at all. And I think there wasn't much memorable in it. I mean, the only thing they could have done was, Undertaker makes his Royal Rumble debut here. He only eliminates, I think, 3 to 4 guys. And actually, the way he's eliminated is pretty cool. It takes both members of the Legion of Doom to clothesline him over, and he still lands on his feet. So that's probably a memorable part of it. For some reason, Brian Knobs of the Nasty Boys was one of the last three in it. That didn't make much sense, but yeah, I mean, you had at times funny cast of characters here and some of the memorable names of the time, but it just nothing in it was really something that would stay with you. And as you say, a very predictable winner. So overall, I mean, how would you rank it in terms of an event? Game
The
of two
Rumble
halves.
itself, definitely, I think everybody was raving about the undercard performance from most of the wrestlers. So I think a mixed bag. And I'm not going to say the Rumble was bad because I enjoy every Rumble, but it was probably not amongst the best ones that we've had.
One of the interesting things coming out of that was, and I didn't realize this until I went back and had a look at it, but this was the most successful Royal Rumble from a purchase point of view, money perspective, until 1999. So it was obviously the WWF super hot, even the US
Yep.
then, and this whole kind of the emotions that were going into this, it was huge. So actually, even though the Royal Rumble that's going to come in the next year is regarded as the best, if not one of the best, um, this one was actually more successful. But anyway, we've covered the Royal Rumble in kind of really short form. Let's get to the controversial topic of the time, Sergeant Slaughter and the use of the Gulf War. I know you've got some views around that.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just a bit of background. The late '90s saw some trouble in the Gulf between Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, various parties involved. Eventually, the US coming in 1991. But as the WWF has always done, they've kind of played on what's been happening in the world. What's been happening to America. So wherever America is involved, for example, with Russia and the Nikolai Volkov angle, the USSR, they've always had something like this playing in the background. And this wasn't the first time that the Gulf has actually been involved in an angle. So back in the mid 80s, there was the Iranian hostage crisis, and very soon after that, they introduced the Iron Sheik. Now, the Iron Sheik is a legendary character,
Even to this day.
to this day, supposedly of Arab descent, and he would play the antagonizer, the heel of the day. Was incredibly, successful at playing that role. And in response, the WWF had Sergeant Slaughter come in as the babyface,
As
and
the good
throughout,
guy then, yeah.
yeah, as the good guy, and throughout that period, that mid '80s period, he was probably the second most successful babyface that the WWF had, maybe behind Hogan, maybe behind Andre as well in terms of characters, but he was right up there in terms of success, and it was all down to that angle. And again, WWF playing on what's happening in the world. Fast forward a little bit, Sergeant Slaughter takes a break from WWF, eventually comes back at the end of 1990. Well, we've got General Adnan and the Iron Sheik coming in as well. But Sergeant Slaughter's role in this was actually to come back as a turncoat, so almost going against, and not almost, but actually going against American values and saying that he supported the opposition in this case, because America had gone soft and he preferred the brutal regime of the Gulf states. So very interesting that an American character would come back and do a turn like that for a
But
crash.
they kind of changed it, didn't they? Because if you go back and look at it, initially when he came in the summer of 1990, he actually came in as his first name was Drill Sergeant Slaughter, and he was supposed to be a guy who hated the fact that the Cold War was over. And he was kind of this kind of disgruntled, why are we making friends with Russia? And you've betrayed me. And he was supposed to be that kind of character. But as you say, when the Gulf War situation started, they saw an opportunity, and they were like, well, actually, let's make him the sympathizer here. And I don't know, there was rumors at the time now, Bruce Pritchard has said in his podcast that they were looking at Tugboat to initially play this character. And I don't see that, but obviously he's saying that was the initial plan. But once they got Sergeant Slaughter, it just fit in. But certainly that wasn't his first kind of character they brought him in. But then, yeah, you embrace this, and it ramped up as it went. And I don't think they were expecting war to break out. And then, as you say, they put him up against the Ultimate Warrior, thinking, you know, you win the title here, then you have the Ultimate American Hero Hulk Hogan take him on, and it's going to be amazing. But I think at the time of the Royal Rumble, the actual Desert Storm operation where the US got involved started 3 days before this, and it became real. This now wasn't just a conflict, it was an actual war. And at that point, the thinking was, should they go ahead with this? Because yes, wrestling's a form of entertainment, but this was real now. And do you play a character like this? I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Because obviously they went ahead with it, and we do get to that main event of WrestleMania. But what history shows is that the popularity started to wane in the US, and many people point to it being because of this
Yeah, and let's
situation.
just look at some of the things that they were doing. So they were carrying in the flags of the opposition countries into arenas to such an extent that arenas themselves would come to the WWF and complain and say, you can't do this in our arena, because it was driving audiences crazy. They were getting lots of complaints. The legendary wrestling critic Dave Meltzer, he absolutely went to town on Vince McMahon and the WWF around this time, and just how could they make money off the blood of Americans? Now, I've never been of that world viewpoint, and I've always said everything is fair game. Um, so for me, using real life is actually what brought in WWF's most popular era of all time, and we'll come to that later on. But I think
But
there's
there's
always
levels, isn't there? There's some things you don't want to cross, maybe. And the guy I think at the time was wearing a bulletproof vest, needed security because he was playing this character. And they by the time they get around to WrestleMania, the war is actually over. The war lasted for about 42 days. So going into February, this is going to come to an end, but they're still carrying this on,
yeah,
and
indeed.
it just I think they got the whole vibe wrong in this. And I get your point that it's all about taking something which is real life and making it work. And they did make it work later on, and they had made it work in the past. But I think this was probably one issue because there was troops involved, and there was combat that it had more downside than upside in the
But
end
I
when
mean,
they.
I've got to say that makes no sense to me, in that we accept so many things in life. Like if a movie is made a couple of years later on that same subject, it makes lots of money. Is that profiting from the dead as well
Well, I'll
as the
tell you what.
WWF?
Well,
Or
I guess the counter to that would be when you watch a movie, right? The actors who are playing the characters, you see them separately as well. So they'll talk about I'm playing this character and this is what it's going to be. In wrestling, there wasn't. At that point, we're going back to us, right? You thought Sergeant Slaughter was this guy. You thought Hulk Hogan was this guy. They are the characters they play. You don't know the people behind it. So that's why this guy was getting security and
yeah,
in many respects. So I get what you're saying, and I think people became more sophisticated later on. But the bottom line was, to me, it was just boring, and that's why I just find this whole part of '91 going back and looking at it dull. I think things pick up later in the year, and that's when we started watching as well. But to me, him being in the main event, the champion, it just wasn't interesting.
there was a certain look that the WWF was going for at that point, and he didn't fit that, in my opinion. That's why I never took it seriously, or I never really liked it that much, that whole angle.
I think
And the
most
fact
people
that they
did.
extended it
Yeah.
out so long from start to finish, when the war itself was done and dusted within no time,
And
that
look at the
also
other
didn't
thing
help.
was they were there at one point, right? Thought this big match was going to draw 100,000
Yeah,
people arena, the LA Coliseum, and in the end, ticket sales weren't good enough. And there's been various excuses made about that, but they ended up moving to a smaller venue, which was around 20,000 people, just because it wasn't this big, huge clamor for this. And I think in hindsight, if they could have done Warrior Hogan 2, that would have been bigger.
yep.
Or they could have had this match, but then Hogan moves on to something else. Because as you say, the Sergeant Slaughter character, one, people didn't like it in the US for what was going on, and outside of that, I think people just didn't fully fit into it. And as you say, they prolonged it too much. And for us, the boom period was coming, but in the US, it started to wane because of that. And I think they picked it up a little bit post WrestleMania with other people getting more prominence, and people like Sergeant Slaughter, even though it continued to the summer, then kind of phased out of it. But to me, one, fine, they went ahead and did it, but it wasn't executed well, and people were
Yeah, I
either
think,
annoyed by it or
yeah,
didn't care about it,
and
and
I think
that's why to
that's,
me it's a big
yeah,
flop.
and yeah, you're right. So that's the reason that it wasn't successful, that people weren't entertained and it didn't work. But as we're trying it, I've got no issue at all with them doing stuff like that.
And your surname's Hussein, right? So are you any relation?
I can't possibly comment.
Right, Wax. Let's zero in on WrestleMania 7 then. So we started this from the viewpoint of 30 years to this month. So we've covered the month before and the events leading up to it. Now we're into the month after it, WrestleMania 7. And I think we both touched upon the fact that this was billed as going to be a big, huge event, but actually, from a box office perspective and I guess, critical perspective, it was actually not that successful. And once again, you've watched this event recently, and we're not going to go into a full review, but you're going to give us your overview and thoughts, and I'll chip in.
Yep. So, like a typical WrestleMania, there were lots of celebrity appearances throughout the show, including the now former Mr. President Donald Trump. We had Chuck Norris and Macaulay Culkin as well as part of the audience, and it just continued that trend of trying to make WrestleMania seem, bigger than life and the biggest event that WWF could put on. And the fact that they had crossover celebrity appearances, I think, certainly added to that. But Flash, what was your favorite celebrity appearance of all time in a WrestleMania?
Of all of them, I think it's going to have to be Mike Tyson when we covered 1998. That was the game changer for
Yep.
WWF. So I know we're going 8 years into the future, but I'd say it was him. And if you're going back before our time, it'd be probably Muhammad Ali at WrestleMania 1 to really give it, true legitimacy. But
Yep.
for me, Tyson's, that was how you use a celebrity properly. And I think a lot of people that are listening to us, that's the period that's really going to be of
Yep.
interest to them once we get through a few years. But yeah, what about yourself?
I think obviously the ones you've mentioned, but the other one I would say is Mr. T.
Mr.
Back
T,
in
yeah, of course.
WrestleMania 1 and 2, and he was a great character. Both for TV, and he was actually made for the wrestling world, wasn't he? Just his whole demeanor and his appearance. But let's look at some of the highlights and some of the matches that
Yeah, of
were
this
on
event,
this
yeah.
event. There were numerous matches, and we're not covering them all. But the one of the key points that started, and this was the streak. The streak actually started at WrestleMania 7, Undertaker against Jimmy Snuka. Jimmy Snuka, a favorite wrestler of mine. I
Why?
couldn't I couldn't really
Why?
explain it, but I think it was to do with his whole crazy persona and his top rope splash that he used to do. I always thought
Because he
he
was
was
a
a cool
legend
character.
before, right? So in the leading up to the first WrestleMania, Jimmy Snuka was seen as before Hulk Hogan came in, the most popular guy in the company, aside from Andre the Giant. But when we see him at this period, he's well past all of that, and actually just losing to people. But you're right, this was really significant because this is where the Undertaker's WrestleMania streak begins, and actually it was the new Phenom taking on
The
the
old
old
Phenom, yeah.
Phenom.
Absolutely. So I think that made perfect sense, that matchup. Later on, we also had the Nasty Boys against the Hart Foundation. So two very iconic tag teams from my memory, at least. Fash, what were your thoughts about each of the tag teams?
I thought the Nasty Boys were rubbish. I've got
Oh
no
no!
no positive things to say about them. I mean, if you're talking about fast forwarding something, it's a Nasty Boys match. I know they had some good ones. The Heart Foundation were great. I mean, I didn't really appreciate the Heart Foundation back then, and they were not one of my favorite teams from my kind of fandom point of view. But obviously, Bret Hart then broke out. But to me, it was like, I wasn't a big fan of the Hearts being the champions, but they were a top team. And the Nasty Boys, I mean, I didn't care about. So it was all about Bret Hart for me here. And the other three, nothing to write home about.
Well, I mean,
I know you're, well, it
interestingly,
seems like you're a Nasty Boy fan. And once again, I'm trying to work out why.
well, first of all, I mean, this was actually the last televised appearance of the Hart Foundation together. Shortly after this, Jim the Anvil
That's right.
Neidhart would get fired for probably not the first time and certainly not the last time. He certainly had many run-ins with Vince. Bret Hart would then obviously go on to have a great, stellar singles career. We'll talk more about that in future episodes. But Nasty Boys, how can you dislike the Nasty Boys? I mean, they were an entertaining duo.
What was entertaining about them? What was
Everything, just their mannerisms, their appearance, everything they would do in the ring, the way they would trash talk, their finisher, the best finisher of all time,
the pit
maybe
stop?
the pit stop, where they would take the opponent's
Explain,
face.
explain the pit stop to those that can't remember or
So
just blocked out of their minds like me.
once they've beaten up their opponents enough, they take the back of the head of one individual, they grab it and face first into the armpit of one of the Nasty Boys. Obviously, the Nasty Boys have worked up quite a sweat by this point, and as you can imagine, it's a deadly, deadly maneuver. and very successful for them over the years.
Well, those that have been around you might say they've probably experienced similar odors. But once again, I think we should do a Facebook poll here. Ask people if the Nasty Boys were rubbish or if they were actually this entertaining team that I've completely missed.
I think you'll be surprised at how popular they really were.
But yeah, they became the champions here.
Yeah,
That's
they
the,
became the
the most
champion here.
disgraceful thing of the whole
Well, I think
whole event.
signaled the end of the Hart Foundation and the push for Brett thereafter. Moving on, we've got one thing that I remember really vividly from back in the day is the blindfold match between Jake the Snake Roberts and Rick Martel. A feud that was started off when Rick Martel sprayed Jake the Snake with his cologne. Now, interestingly, Fash, do you know what that cologne was called?
Arrogance, I think.
It was called Arrogance, and I've heard rumors that it turned up in your house and you've been spraying yourself with it over the years every day.
Oh, that's confidence, my friend, not arrogance.
That confidence,
slightly different brand.
Slightly different. But anyway, this
certainly
match was...
certainly the Nasty Boys should be using some arrogance on.
Well, maybe they should
armpits.
have shared.
Yeah.
But this match, a blindfold match, the first time, maybe even the last time that I remember seeing a blindfold match. I think there was one more potentially, but interesting concept. Both had a hood over them. A hood.
These were the days. These were the days with all these crazy concepts. So.
Exactly. And this event actually seemed to have very interesting matches throughout. But anyway, there wasn't much wrestling involved. It was more about the drama. And Jake Snake, I think, he really made this whole angle work. Eventually coming out the winner.
But this is coming near the end of Jake as a good guy.
Yep.
Later on we're going to see the other side of him. But yeah, this was once again another feud when we go back and look at it where there was so much emotion invested in it, and it's going back to that. That's what makes wrestling what it is. People believed that he was blinded. People wanted him to get revenge on Rick Martel. And I remember this match where because they're blindfolded, the crowd's kind of directing Jake to where Rick Martel is, and so it was unique from that perspective. But because it was a really kind of odd concept, you didn't see it really again. And this is obviously the most famous one, if there even was one after it or not. But certainly something which was different.
And don't you think Rick Martel portrayed an excellent heel? Just his whole vibe. He was
brilliant. Yeah, I think it's another one of those characters you didn't appreciate at the time.
Yeah.
So there's so many, when I look back now, guys that you didn't really care about, but actually you see how good they were, and he was perfect for that role. And actually, I think because he didn't really apply himself in terms of, he's going to be in and out of the WWF, because I think what you learned was he was doing other things outside of the wrestling business, and he could have became probably much bigger in the era that's coming after this. But he wasn't as committed, I guess, to the organization. But no, he played that character perfectly.
Yep. And then we move on to probably the highlight of the whole event, which was Ultimate Warrior versus the Macho King, Randy Savage. Not Macho Man at that point, Macho King. And this was a career versus career match, leading on, obviously, from Royal Rumble when Macho King screwed the Ultimate Warrior. This was the natural progression. And amazingly, they put on a 20-minute match. 20 minutes for Ultimate Warrior is like a marathon for most people.
I mean, Savage was such a great opponent for him and got the best out of him.
Yeah, it was an absolutely terrific match. There was a lot of emotion, as you keep mentioning, a lot of emotion involved in this match. We noted Elizabeth sitting in the crowd at the start of the match. Very interesting considering she had broken up from the Macho King, a while back when
the storyline,
Man had turned into Macho King and turned heel. The match went 20 minutes. Eventually, Warrior comes out victor, which means the Macho King has to retire. He's devastated, of course. In comes his then Valley sensational Sherry. Gives him a few kicks while he's down. Just a word on sensational Sherry. I mean, as far as female valets and managers go, she probably is the top of the list.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one you didn't appreciate at the time, how good she was playing that bad character. But yeah, she goes down as one of the best, and I think it really worked with the Macho Man. That's probably, and with Shawn Michaels later on. In the middle, I think she was also managing Ted DiBiase after this, but that wasn't anything to really remember. But yeah, in terms of playing that antagonist, she was amazing, and she's, because of how she behaves, is what happens next in terms of you talking about this. This was WWF at its best. If you want to look at how they can be everything to everyone in terms of getting those emotions out, this whole match and the aftermath is basically a great
Yep.
example of it. And
So Sensational Sherry is giving a right kicking to Macho King when he's down, and in out of nowhere comes Elizabeth, who takes Sherry out the ring, wipes her out, and we get what is probably the most emotional moment that wrestling has ever seen up to that moment. And we get the reunion of the Macho Man and Elizabeth in the ring. So, Fash, how many tears did you shed at that moment?
at that moment, I shed zero tears because I didn't watch it live. And even after, I didn't shed any tears because, listen, Elizabeth would have been a good wife for anyone. So I was probably jealous of the Macho Man, and probably jealous of him when he was with Sensational Sherry as well. But looking at the match, I think there was nuances to it because if you go to the actual match, like you say, it's a great match between the two. But the Warrior pins him with one foot on his chest. Prior to that, the Macho Man hit him with 5 elbow drops. So what they were playing here was both guys were going to the max and couldn't defeat the other, and then it took a number of shoulder blocks and then the humiliation of just one foot on the chest.
Yep.
So they essentially showed in the story that Randy Savage is below the ground now, right? He's finished. Then, like say, Sherry comes in, turns on him for basically losing. And then you get going to that previous relationship, and that Elizabeth comes and does the save. And in that moment, then suddenly the Macho Man's a good guy again
Yep.
in
And
that final. So
that's
that was just great storytelling,
yep.
as you say, in 20 odd minutes. And what it set up was because obviously the Match Man wasn't retiring at that point. They created a scenario where people would clamor for him to come
Yep.
back down the line as this good guy. So to me, that was just perfect
And
wrestling
that's
storytelling.
why I think I consider Macho Man as one of the all-time greats. Right up there with
Absolutely.
Hulk
Yeah.
Hogan and Warrior, because he was involved in so many memorable angles and memorable moments with Elizabeth, with Sherry, with Hulk Hogan, with Warrior, and the ring. He was second to none in that era.
Yeah,
And
I think of that time
character,
you talk about it, it's Hogan Warrior Macho Man, but the Macho Man deserved so much more at times. And we'll talk about maybe Hogan screwing him over at different periods in time. But as a character, he worked so well as a bad guy, he worked so well
yep,
as a good guy, and really, he's going to start to be phased out down the line, but he shouldn't have been. And then he proved when he went to WCW that definitely he
yeah.
could still do so much more. But to me, right, this event was a one match card, and I know you're going to finish off with the main event, but this is, if I was saying to anyone, what to watch on this show, it's this.
This could
Um,
have been a main event of a
well, this should have,
WrestleMania.
yeah, this
You
could
know,
have been them
this
for the
could have
title.
been Warrior carrying on his title reign
Yeah, exactly.
against
Taking
Macho Man.
Randy Savage, and this could have happened earlier as well. And you could have.
Yep,
So the thing was, this was the proper event, and you see here, right? We're going back to the initial discussion that we had previously about using the Warrior correctly as well. This was the Ultimate Warrior back to the way he was
yep,
before he won the title, and this was Randy Savage at his best as well, and that's why they stole the show here.
yep.
But we had one more match, which
We
I'm
did. Yep.
guessing a guy like you would enjoy, which was Hulk Hogan against Sergeant Slaughter.
Well, surprisingly, I don't have much to say about this match other than it went 20 minutes. There wasn't much happening.
19 minutes too long.
Exactly. And again, this goes down to I wasn't a fan of Sergeant Slaughter. I wasn't a fan of his work. And Hogan obviously very limited. He can't carry anybody. He needs to be carried.
I don't know, man. I'm
Uh,
gonna I'm gonna jump in there because Hogan, if people say this, Hulk Hogan does enough in terms of the audience. You watch some of his stuff in Japan, and he's actually really good. But you're right, he needs the right opponent with him. And it was a bit formulaic. I think it was more Sergeant Slaughter couldn't really do much at this point.
yep. Anyway, the predictable happens. Hulk Hogan is the victor, wins the world title again, gets his opportunity to pose in front of the crowd. And I think then he goes into the back, and Fash, you can pick up on what happens next.
Yeah, so rather than ending this, which they should have and just forgotten about that they ever did it, they actually continued this. So I think what happened was they showed up behind the scenes. Hulk Hogan goes in the back to celebrate, and Sergeant Slaughter and his cronies throw a fireball or something at him. You can't make this
Yeah,
stuff up, and
crazy.
that was a sign of this is going to continue,
Yeah.
and it did, unfortunately.
Yeah, I
But
mean, they should have ended the program there. I think that would have made perfect sense.
yeah, exactly. So, what are your overall thoughts then? For me, as I said, a one match card, interesting characters, and again, the only memorable points for me, yeah, this beginning of the streak and the Ultimate Warrior Macho Man Elizabeth Sherry thing. But other than that,
I
wasn't
think
that
actually it had
impressed.
enough in there to be thought of as a proper WrestleMania. So I enjoyed overall. I get the main event wasn't great, but the standout moment, obviously, Randy Savage and Elizabeth's reunion and the match with Warrior. I just think, things like that can make a whole event, you know, feel really positive and great. So that's why I would rate it
Like you
quite
said,
high.
they should have ended it there. That should have been the ending, but it
Yeah,
wasn't.
yeah,
And that would lead to, and coming out of this, right, we're putting a bow on this now, but coming out of this event, even though the whole Sergeant Slaughter thing continues, some of these other characters are going to move into more interesting directions. Right, man. So we've covered a lot of ground in these episodes, leading into the fall, as they would say in the US, of 1991. What's on schedule for the next episode?
yep. Fash, we've set the scene, and now we're going to move on to the era that we actually watched live. So from midway of '91, that's when we really started watching everything sort of live. And we really started to get into our wrestling. We've got the big feud between Jake the Snake Roberts and Macho Man to come. We've got a couple of massive debuts, Ric Flair and Sid Justice. We've got Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker. We've got so much coming up in the next few
Yep.
episodes, and we're really going to get into the period that we've enjoyed the most.
Yeah, and you're also going to chart the career of Bret Hart eventually, and I'm going to look at the career of The Undertaker. So we're going to have different segments. But as you say, we're getting to the business end of 91 now, and then into the years that I think every fan who's listening to us can remember. So yeah, lots to cover, listeners, viewers. As ever, give us your feedback and ideas as well in terms of what we can cover. But now it's time to close this episode. So he's Wax, I'm Fash. This is Wrestling with Memories, and I still am the champion of the world.